Congratulations to you and the Institute of Public Affairs for your successful campaign. But the war is not over. The only way to win this war is to fundamentally defeat the kind of people who think that censorship of ordinary people's free speech is a good thing.
Australia is the greatest nation on earth. And at the referendum last year, Australians told the elites they want to keep it that way. Is 2024 the year mainstream Australians continue to secure our way of life, or will the elites strike back? In Season 3 of Australia's Future, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott will share his unique insight on the future of the Australian way of life. Hello Tony, and g'day to all of our viewers. Lovely to be back. Today we'll be talking about the big victory for free speech with the misinformation laws, the ban on under-16s using social media, the International Criminal Court, and the future of the global order. Tony, great to be back.
Dan, it's wonderful to be with you. And I guess I should start by saying congratulations to you and the Institute of Public Affairs for your successful campaign to get this misinformation and disinformation bill pulled. I mean, it's recently been labelled the Mad Bill, misinformation and disinformation, and that's exactly what it was. It was an assault on free speech. Thank God the Greens and the Coalition, for their different reasons, have combined to block this bill. But the fundamental point I'd make, Dan, is that if the current government is re-elected come March, they'll bring it back. They'll bring it back. So we have had a tactical win, but we have not yet had a strategic victory. We've won a battle, and that's great, but the war is not over. The only way to win this war is to fundamentally defeat the kind of people who think that censorship of the online world, censorship of ordinary people, but not censorship of government and other authorities, censorship of ordinary people's free speech is a good thing.
Well, thanks, Tony, for that. And it was a long work in progress. It goes back to actually 2022 when these laws were first floated. So it was a long time coming, but certainly a positive outcome for us to have that removed. So just on that, I think one of the issues with the laws was just mainstream Australians opposed them. They understood it was a two-tiered system, that the elites would be exempt, everybody else would be subject to the laws. Doesn't it show how brazen the political left have become in the fact that these laws would even be considered in the first place?
Yeah. So much happens today which would have been unthinkable even a decade ago. I mean, look at this whole trans mania as one obvious example. Free speech was an article of faith across the board a decade ago, but particularly during the pandemic, in this climate of fear and judgmentalism, all these things have started to come into vogue. So look, you know, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. This is a very, very significant win. And again, I really do hope that the IPA, its members and supporters, feel vindicated today. And I hope that the IPA, its members and supporters, feel encouraged to keep up your campaigns of education and edification, because they're really important. They matter. I mean, I think it was Kennedy, was it? Or was it Yates? I can never remember which. All that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to stay silent. Well, the IPA was not silent on this. You were very, very, very vocal. And thank God you've succeeded.
Yeah, thank you. Do you get the sense that the tide is turning now a little bit? Because last year we beat The Voice. This year we beat misinformation. I think net zero is on its last legs. We're now finally having a debate about mass migration. The education system and its failures are no longer able to be disguised in any way. Not even the government defends the current education system. I really get the sense that things are starting to go in the right direction. There is a long way to go, but in my time, I've been at the IPA for over 8 years. I think this is the most confident I've felt about, you know, the coming period of time. So just interested in your assessment and if you feel that shift happening as well.
Well, this is a good question, Dan. I would like to think that we have finally reached peak woke. and that we are over it. But, as we have seen before, there were fightbacks by the ordinary person, whether it be the Trump victory in 2016, the Brexit victory in 2016, the triumph over the Voice last year, and now the new Trump win, and at least up till now, every time the people have spoken, the elites have just carried on regardless. I mean, look at the way the defeatist and declinist establishment in Britain frustrated and thwarted Brexit at every turn. Look at the way the first Trump presidency was undermined from the beginning. Look at the way even now in states like Victoria, treaty and truth is in full swing, notwithstanding the overwhelming rejection of the Voice last year. So yes, there are some very encouraging signs, but I don't think we can take anything for granted. The long march of the left through the institutions has been remarkably extensive. I mean, even the military, the judiciary, the church, the Liberal Party, all of them have been to some extent compromised by the long march of the left through the institutions. And until there is a long counter-march through the institutions, which is probably the work of a generation at least, I don't think we can feel confident. I mean, Thatcher's wonderful phrase that the facts are conservative stands because, let's face it, conservatism is absolutely rooted in reality. Conservatism, in the end, is instinctual, and it's based on the practical, common-sense response to the everyday problems that people face, founded, I suppose, on that instinctive aspiration to do better for yourselves and for your kids and for your neighbours and for your communities and for your country. But common sense has been in retreat and eclipse for so long. But yes, let's hope finally it's making a comeback.
Well, one area that we're not going to find any common sense, I don't think, is in the International Criminal Court. You have written quite strongly on your social media with regards to the issuance of an arrest warrant for the Israeli Prime Minister, saying there is no moral equivalence between democratic Israel and terrorist Hamas. The ICC arrest warrant that makes no distinction between terrorist aggression and national self-defence is a shameful travesty. Downer, as in Alexander Downer, former Foreign Minister for Australia, is right, unless it rethinks Australia should withdraw from this compromised and conflicted body. So, Tony, this is, I think we talked about this probably 6 odd months ago when a similar undertaking was done by the ICC. It's time to withdraw, isn't it, basically?
Well, yes, it is, because I can't see them suddenly doing an about turn. It's possible to lament the very high civilian casualties of the entirely justifiable Israeli fight back against Hamas, Hezbollah and Iran. Of course it's tragic when there are civilian casualties, but when you've got a terrorist group, an apocalyptic terrorist group that's using civilians as human shields as a matter of course, it is impossible to fight effectively against them without some, in this case a lot, of civilian casualties. So by holding Israel to such a standard, the International Criminal Court is effectively condoning Hamas, and that's just wrong. It's absolutely wrong. I mean, Winston Churchill's famous statement, "I refuse to be impartial as between the fire brigade and the fire." You can always argue about the tactics, but when it comes to the attempt to beat and ultimately destroy an apocalyptic terrorist group, there's only one side that you can be on, and that's the side of liberal democratic Israel, which is fighting for its very existence against a whole range of organisations with their strings being pulled out of Tehran that are absolutely bent on its destruction.
And the government here so far has been typically mealy-mouthed, speaking out both sides of its mouth, not saying that it would arrest Benjamin Netanyahu, but also saying that it would not arrest Netanyahu. Now, there's a whole bunch of nations that said that they would do that. Ireland, Norway, Belgium, Spain, Slovenia, Switzerland, Austria have all said that they would arrest Netanyahu if he was to go there. I think the US is not a signatory, I don't believe, to that, and rightfully so. So they wouldn't be involved in this whatsoever. If Benjamin Netanyahu were to come to Australia, what would be the correct action of the Australian government in your assessment?
Well, I think the correct action of the Australian government would be to welcome him, to absolutely welcome him as one of the very foremost leaders in the fight for freedom in the world today. I mean, along with Vladimir Zelensky, Bibi Netanyahu is fighting for his country's survival, and in both Zelensky's case and Netanyahu's case, but particularly in Netanyahu's case, his country is an exemplar of freedom, and has been since the creation of the State of Israel. I mean, from the very beginning, the State of Israel has offered full protection to the rights of minorities, provided it does remain a Jewish homeland. So look, yes, the Israelis have got to do their best to minimise civilian casualties, and typically that's exactly what they do. It doesn't mean that there aren't terrible mistakes made sometimes. It doesn't mean that once in a while people will go a bit over the top. But in the end, whose side are we on? We have got to be on the side of liberal democracy versus an apocalyptic death cult. And the ICC has fundamentally misread this, and it's hard to avoid the conclusion that in the end this is a political court, not a court of justice.
Well, Tony, let's return back to the domestic front. One of the other matters that's sort of related to misinformation in some ways is the proposal to ban under 16-year-olds from accessing social media or certain social media platforms. Now, this has support from the government and the opposition, which suggests that any legislation would be passed quite easily through the Parliament, potentially this week, which is the last sitting week of Parliament. Now, there's lots of concerns about this. One of them is the prospect of digital identification, where everybody might need to have some kind of identification to use the internet, because how else could you enforce an age ban and other concerns? But on the other side, there's concerns of parents and others in the community about the impact of social media on young Australians. So very interested in your thoughts and perspective, Tony, on this issue.
Well, Dan, I think it is an important issue, and it certainly does deserve to be widely discussed. And the trouble with a lot of legislation is that it's conceived in haste and implemented in a hurry, and often enough we regret at our leisure the things that we do in haste. But in principle, I think this is a good thing. There's no doubt that the mental health of youngsters has declined in the age of social media. In the old days, you might be bullied at school, but at least when you went home, the bullying stopped. The bullying ended at the school gates. Now, of course, the bullying's 24/7 because so much of it is online. And I think parents are right to be concerned about this. And given social pressures, it may well be better if the government bans it as opposed to just relying on parents and others to do the right thing. So I'm broadly in favour of this ban, but there's a bigger point that I'd like to make, Dan. We've talked a moment ago about the withdrawal of the misinformation and disinformation bill, and we both think this is a wonderful thing. Still, there is no doubt that the online world is a Wild West. I reckon it is a Wild West, fundamentally, because it's possible to be anonymous when you're online. Now, one of the positives of this proposed ban for under 16s on social media is that in order to ban under 16s, we have to know who they are. And if this leads to a general move across the online world for everyone's online identity to be traceable to a real human identity, well, I think that actually it won't just protect young people from the psychological pressures of online bullying, it might actually clean up the Wild West of the online world. So I think it is a positive development. I just hope that the bill has been adequately drafted, and there was some talk a week or so back that one of the online outlets, I can't remember whether it was TikTok or Snapchat, was going to be excluded. Well,
I think it was Snapchat.
It's got to be all of them. I mean, you know, if the online world is out of bounds for people under 16, it's all of it. It's all of it.
I think one of the issues is, and you mentioned the drafting of the legislation, I'm really concerned about it because the government has only given literally 1 day of submission period. And this is a big issue, like in terms of how young people interact with the online world, how we enforce these laws and so forth. It fundamentally changes the regulatory architecture of how people access the internet. And as a society, we may want to go down that path, but I'm not convinced there's been enough of a debate in our society to properly inform policymakers of this. And because it has bipartisan support, my concern is it will be rushed through for a cheap, short-term political win, and that there will be unintended consequences from this. So my view is that the bill should be withdrawn and have a proper process, a proper committee process to hear different views to make sure that we actually get it right if as a society we do go down this path.
I think that's a very fair point, Dan. I mean, given that it does have bipartisan support, both the Prime Minister and the opposition leader could pledge their parties to swiftly passing the legislation once they're confident that it's as good as it can be, whether that's early in the new year or indeed after an election, because you're right, it's much better to get the legislation right than it is to rush it through this week as opposed to February or March or April or May next year. And in the meantime, given that this legislation is coming, parents should be saying to their kids, well, sorry, hand back the smartphone, or we're going to disable all of the various functions. Now, I mean, I'm not smart enough to know how to do all of that, but I'm sure a lot of parents are. Hand back the smartphone or have the functions disabled in preparation for the legal prohibition which is coming.
All right, well, we'll keep talking about this because this is, I think, a fairly major change over the coming months. Let's turn to our final topic today, Tony, back to the international front, which is the global order. And you were keen to have a chat about the future of Pax Americana under Trump Mark II and what this might mean. I think some are concerned about the supposed isolationist streak that Trump has, although that does go back to America's first president, George Washington, who warned against foreign entanglements and others, whereas I think NATO countries and Australia and others would rightly be concerned that the American administration will pressure us to spend more on our defence and to spend it better than what we are currently doing. So I think we're in for a period of pretty big change on the international front. So what's yours, as you survey the international arena, what's your assessment of how it's going to shape up?
I think the first thing to do, Dan, is to appreciate that the world that was created first by the Pax Britannica and then the Pax Americana is the best world we've ever enjoyed. That's not to say that it's perfect, and that's not to say that things haven't gone backwards a bit in the last few years. But if you look at the world at the beginning of 2020, more safe, more fair, more free, more rich for more people than at any time in human history. And that was essentially because of the Anglo-American supremacy in economics, in military strength, and indeed in ideas and cultural vitality. And it's now under massive challenge, absolutely massive challenge from a range of dictators united only by their hatred of the West. There's the militarist dictator in Moscow, as we've said. There's the Islamist dictator in Tehran. There's the communist dictator in Beijing, and there are a range of others, such as the North Koreans and the Cubans, who are allied with the axis of dictatorship. Now, the new Trump administration plainly wants all of America's allies to do more, and to its credit, it wants to minimise as opposed to maximise the global hotspots. Understandably, the incoming Trump administration would like the war in Ukraine to end, would like peace to break out in the Middle East, would like the tension across the Taiwan Straits to ease. But the best way to have peace is through strength, not weakness. And I understand the instinct that says, let's do a deal, let's trade territory for security, but it's got to be real security. And the only way that the Ukrainians would have real security is if they have a NATO-style guarantee, or if they have, let's say, British and French troops as a tripwire on any new border that there might be. The only way that Israel will have real security is if the threat of Iranian nuclear weapons is removed once and for all. The only way Taiwan will enjoy real security is if the commissars in Beijing understand that any attack on Taiwan will not pit 1.4 billion Chinese against 25 million Taiwanese, but it will pit China against a strong alliance of democracies, America, Japan, Australia, maybe Britain and India as well. So it's very important that the incoming administration appreciates the mindset of those it's up against. There's an absolutism in the desire of Vladimir Putin to recreate Greater Russia. There is an apocalyptic absolutism in the Iranian mullahs' desire to destroy the little Satan and then the great Satan. There is a messianic quality to Xi Jinping's desire to overcome the so-called century of humiliation by taking Taiwan and then dominating the region and then the wider world. That's got to be understood. Now, that doesn't mean that you've got to fight on every front, but it does mean knowing what you're up against and not compromising on the essentials.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to China, they've said, or the Chinese Communist Party has said on a number of occasions that they will invade Taiwan in 2027. I'm
not sure that they've quite said that.
Right.
The general view, and this is the intelligence agency's assessments based, I presume, on careful study of all the things that have been said both publicly and privately that they know about. Xi has instructed his generals to be ready to invade by 2027. Now, that's only 2 and a bit years away. And of course, China certainly has great ability to cause mischief immediately, should it choose. I mean, as we speak, it looks like there are new quasi-blockades being prepared around Taiwan. So it's a very dangerous situation. It could escalate at any minute. And again, our problem here in Australia is that we are militarily, economically, and above all else psychologically unprepared for a much more difficult and potentially dangerous world ahead. Historically, we have always done our bit to defend the freedom of the wider world. We have always stood by our friends and allies. In times past, when things moved more slowly, we had the time to gird our loins and to prepare ourselves. I mean, in 1914, War was declared in September, I think. We were able, within a couple of months, to send an expedition to Rabaul and what was then German New Guinea. We were able to dispatch the first of the Anzac convoys in October. We finally went into action in April the following year in Gallipoli. In 1939, war was declared in September, and we had the second AIF in Africa by the end of the following year. Things could happen much, much more quickly today, and that's why our whole military preparedness needs to be dramatically escalated.
It sounds like we need a stronger Western alliance to be ready and prepared for this, not just militarily, but I also think economically. With China, I think having fairly successfully got international supply chains to be reorientated around them. They're a major industrial manufacturing powerhouse, and I think net zero has contributed to that. What's your, just to end on this, what's your thoughts on the future of the Western alliance? We've got NATO, but I think NATO has its pros and cons. How do we strengthen the Western alliance to be better prepared for these upcoming potential events?
Well, we better strengthen the NATO alliance by having a much more clear-eyed view of exactly what kind of a predicament we're in. And over the past couple of decades, there's been military, economic and cultural disarmament, unilateral military, economic and cultural disarmament, and we need rearmament urgently in every sphere. Above all else, we need to recover faith in ourselves, and that's why all this angsting over slavery in America, over the empire in Britain and over dispossession here in Australia is so counterproductive. Of course, there are imperfections, indeed horrible injustices in our past, as there are in the past of every country and every culture. But on balance, no societies have done as well as ours have. No societies are more colourblind, less racist than ours, and we need to better appreciate that and act accordingly in our defence.
Well, Tony, thanks for the time. We'll leave it there, and our next chat will be the last one of the year. So I think next time we'll do a review of 2024 and a preview of 2025. So thanks for the time, and looking forward to our next chat.
Me too, Dan.
This is a production of the Centre for the Australian Way of Life at the Institute of Public Affairs. To find out more, visit australia.ipa.org.au.